Okay, guys, today we are going to start our first great river valley civilization, and that is the one that formed around the Nile River Valley in northeast Africa. And the group of people that we're going to be studying over the next couple of days are the ancient Egyptians. One great thing about the ancient Egyptians is you all pretty much know a lot about them. Your middle school and elementary school teachers do a nice job telling you about the pyramids and King Tut and mummification and all kinds of fun stuff, which makes these lessons a little more interesting for you. People lived in that area, since prehistoric times. We start to really see the culture of the Egyptians start to form somewhere around 6000 BC. Herodotus, the man that I have on the front screen there, is a Greek historian that is the father of history, which we'll learn a little bit more about him. And he said that the Egyptian people were the gift of the Nile. If it wasn't for the Nile River, we wouldn't have the Egyptian people. So we start this lesson by focusing once again on the Nile River. So let's talk about the geography of the Nile. So the Nile is about 750 miles long, okay? The Nile Delta is about 4,000 miles long, where it dumps into the Mediterranean Sea, which makes it one of the longest rivers in the world if you count the delta, if you count all the little water and tributaries that are off of the Nile River. Now, the Nile River starts down south in south central Africa and Ethiopia, in the Ethiopian highlands, and it's actually broken into two different parts, the Blue Nile and the White Nile. And you can see that down there in the Ethiopian highlands on this map. That's the Nile River. That's where it starts. Now, the great thing about the Nile River and its geography there in northeast Africa is that it was very protected, which meant if people wanted to start a civilization there, they could. As you're looking at the map, you can see there's the Sahara Desert to the west. You can see the Nubian Desert. You can see the Arabian Desert. You can see that it is surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, and those geographic features served as protection for the people of Egypt. The only place that you could go and invade Egypt from was from the northeast there, right from the Arabian Desert, north of the Red Sea, into that little area there, into what is now Egypt. Now, one thing that the Egyptians really counted on was an annual flood. And when the annual floods would come, they would go away eventually, and they would lay behind silt or fertile soil. In northeast Africa, it is very sunny. There is no frost, which allowed for the Egyptians to farm all year long. We know for a fact that they farmed wheat. We know for a fact that there were fruit trees and so on. How do we know that? Well, look at the cave paintings. Look at the designs that, or not the cave, but look at the drawings and the paintings that we see within tombs, within pyramids, and so on. You can see exactly how these people lived. Now, one other thing that you need in order to survive besides water and food is shelter. And northeast Africa happens to be blessed with clay and granite for building, okay? Large deposits of this in limestone. When you see the Egyptian buildings, and we're going to see a bunch of them over the next couple of days, they were made with clay, they were made with granite, they were made with limestone, which they built with. So if you ever have to answer the question of how did geography play a major role in the formation of Egypt, obviously, you would start with the Nile River, you would continue with its climate, and then you would finish probably with all of the natural resources that it has for building to go along with the protection by the deserts and the seas that surround it. But the real question today is, what makes Egypt a civilization? Now, hopefully, we already know what makes a place a civilization. How is it different than a certain Neolithic village? Well, we already know that we did a concept mapped on the 8 features of civilization. So we should know from the start that Egypt had cities. It had well-centralized government. It had religions, it had jobs, it had social classes, hopefully it had arts and architecture, public works, and writing, the 8 features of a civilization. So let's see how well ancient Egypt does here from the start. Well, as far as technology is concerned, they had copper and they had bronze and they had a potter's wheel, for example. Now, copper was something that was found natural in the earth, and they used it to make bowls and pots, as you see here on the screen. Now, they also use bronze. Now, bronze is something that is not a natural resource. It's not found naturally on Earth, all right? It's a mixture of copper and tin. Now, as far as technology is concerned, you can see that there's a potter's wheel that they use. So they were literally using this tool, which many of us used in middle school. When I was in middle school, I used a potter's wheel. There weren't the electric ones. You actually used a pedal, like you're driving a car. You would press the pedal, and the wheel would spin, and you would put your clay right there on top of the potter's wheel, and it would spin, and you would shape your pot, just like that guy's doing in the image. Now, as far as writing is concerned, the Egyptians had a very, very cool system of writing, which we call hieroglyphics. Now, hieroglyphics, you might not know this, consist of 600 signs and symbols, okay? So compare that to our alphabet that we have here today. Now, those signs and symbols, as you can see on the screen, some of them are animals. You can see lions, you can see hawks, you can see snakes, you can see different symbols and images, which basically represent the signs and the symbols of hieroglyphics. Now, they weren't just using their blood and finger to write on a cave painting to write there. They meant to write, all right? They were using something called papyrus. Papyrus was a plant root that they would use, and they would cut it into thin little strips. And then they would weave it in between the vertical strips and the horizontal strips, okay? And you can see, if you look closely at my screen, you can see lines running up and down and lines running side to side, which shows you that they were meaning to write on papyrus, all right? Now, that's not where we get the word paper from. The Chinese actually invented paper, okay? But this is something that the Egyptians wrote on with something called a reed. Now, what they wrote with was ink, all right? So they were on 100% writing with ink, and it was a mixture of soot and water and something called vegetable gum, all right? So they would take some ash from fire, and they would mix it with water, and they would mix it with vegetable gum, and then they would go ahead and they would write with this, and that's where we get all these great hieroglyphics from. Now, one fact about the hieroglyphics is that not everybody in the Egyptian civilization knew how to write. That talent and that skill was given to the priests of Egypt. The priests were the ones that knew how to write and knew the system of hieroglyphics. Well, over time, Egypt was invaded tremendously, frequently. And at one point, basically, all the priests that knew the system of writing that they called hieroglyphics were killed. And with them, they took the knowledge of the hieroglyphics to their graves with them. So at one point in our world, for a very long time, hieroglyphics was what we called a dead language. It was a dead language, which meant no one knew what the signs and the symbols on the pyramids or the tombs meant. And that went on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, a very long time. Well, the code of hieroglyphics was actually cracked by a pretty cool historical event that we cover in the second semester of our class. And it has to do with a very famous battle. So those of you that are into military history, here's a good one for you. In 1799, there was a guy named Napoleon. He was a leader of France, and he was looking to conquer different places of the world. And he was always intrigued by Egypt. He was intrigued by the pyramids. He was intrigued by what the Egyptian culture and civilization had to offer. So he's going to go down and he's going to actually fight the British, which they were fighting all over the world at this point. In North America, in the 7 Years' War, including India and Asia and Europe. They were fighting the British all over the world. And this makes for a pretty cool backdrop in a famous battle called the Battle of the Pyramids, where the French and the English squared off in a little battle right in front of the pyramids in Giza. Well, what does that have to do with hieroglyphics? Well, what happened was a good story that happens during this little battle. One of Napoleon's men is actually going to kick over a wall. And what comes from that wall is a huge stone, a stone that has writing all over it. And that writing, or that stone actually, was called the Rosetta Stone. Now, you've heard of the Rosetta Stone before because it is a program that you use to learn a language. Well, this is where that company gets its name from. On the stone that one of Napoleon's men kicked over that day, there was 3 different types of writing. There was hieroglyphics, which no one knew. There was Demotic, which in 1799 was a dead language and no one knew. But there was Greek. In 1799, a lot of people spoke Greek. And what Napoleon did was he took this to a linguist, and the linguist said that once he translated the Greek, he found out that the Greek was meant the same exact thing as the hieroglyphics, and they started matching up letters. Now, once they figured out the letters, and basically they were saying the same thing, and it was translated actually to be a certain law code. These were laws that were written down by probably some pharaoh in the near future, to the time period that once you figured out the Greek, then you figured out the hieroglyphics. And at this point, Egypt came alive. It came absolutely alive, and people flocked to Egypt to learn about what was going on and what all the hieroglyphics meant. Now, the first thing we got to know here, and we're going to transition into government right now. The government part of Egypt being a civilization had to do with this guy, Menes. The first state, the first pretty much government on earth happens when this pharaoh, who happened to be the first pharaoh, is going to unite Upper and Lower Egypt to form the first real united state or government on earth. Now, one lesson that we have to learn here has to do with that map, and you can see that the map is situated absolutely perfectly. I want you for a second to look at Lower Egypt, and I want you to look at Upper Egypt. Now, I'm telling you, the map is situated perfectly. But obviously, if you're looking at that map, you will see that Lower Egypt is to the north and Upper Egypt is to the south. Well, there's a reason for that. The reason for that is, remember, the Nile River starts in the Ethiopian highlands, and it flows to the north. So it flows from Upper Egypt through Thebes, through the Nubian desert, through Lower Egypt, and the Nile River actually dumps into the Mediterranean Sea down up there at the Nile Delta. It's one of the few rivers on earth that actually flows from the south to the north. There's one in Alaska, there's one in Russia, there's one in Canada, I believe, and it's one of the few that does that. So the lower part of the river is what we called Lower Egypt. And Menes is going to create this first state or this first government on earth, which is called, when he unites Upper and Lower Egypt into one Egypt. Now, we already know that the leaders of these places were called pharaohs, and pharaohs were thought of as gods. Now, if there had to be a system of government that was in place in Egypt at the start, it was called a dynasty. Now, a dynasty, as you know, are a family of rulers, and dynasties formed over the years. And there are a lot of dynasties, a lot of ruling families in the history of Egypt. And on part 2 of this session, I'm going to tell you why. But in the history of Egypt, there were 30 of these ruling dynasties that actually rose and are going to fall. Now, that's going to get us into the last part of our lesson for today, for part 1 on this section or this introduction. And it has to do how historians have broken Egyptian history into different time periods, okay? In 2700 BC, historians and scientists agree that something good was going on to the point where they had to call or actually name a time period in Egyptian history. And that time period was called the Old Kingdom. So there were 3 time periods in Egyptian history, and they were all called kingdoms. And you might see a pattern forming between the time periods in prehistory and the time periods in Egyptian history. Well, the Old Kingdom had another name, and it was also called the Age of the Pyramids. So from 2700 to 2181 BC, Egyptian history is called the Old Kingdom. Now, this was a time period of the Age of the Pyramids. This is when the pyramids were built. Okay, you can see Saqqara, which is close to the Giza Plateau, which shows basically one of the oldest temples ever found on Earth. It's a temple that was a step pyramid, which basically shows steps moving up to the skies for some reason. You already have done a lot of research on the pyramids and know that they were built to house the pharaohs in death, okay? Giza is the plateau. Giza is the place which is still in Egypt that the pyramids and all of the tombs that I'm going to show you after we get done with this lesson. When we take a virtual tour of the Giza Plateau, you'll see that. Now, one of the most interesting symbols of Giza, besides the pyramids, is also the Sphinx. Now, the Sphinx is located right in front of the pyramids, and it has the body of a lion and the face of a pharaoh. Now, in antiquity, it was said that the Sphinx was basically painted all the colors of the rainbow, and it was placed right in front of the pyramids. Now, its role, it is said, that it was supposed to scare away the evil spirits that wanted to go into and disrupt the pharaohs in their afterlife, where they were buried within the pyramids. All right, we'll take a look at that here in a second when we do our virtual tour of the Giza Plateau. So let's finish up. You know, one other thing that made Egypt's civilization was that it had social classes. And the social classes of Egypt are very easy to understand. First off, we had an upper and a lower class, all right? So the upper class was very, very easy to understand. So it was made up of three different groups. Number one, there was the pharaoh. Number two, there was the pharaoh's royal family. And number three, there were the priests, all right? Those three groups of people made up the upper class in Egypt. Everyone else, scribes, farmers, workers, teachers, everyone else made up the lower class. So it was pretty simple. You had the pharaoh at the top, you had his royal family, you had the priests, and then you had everybody else, okay? And there's a pretty good diagram right there, a social pyramid, so to speak, of the Egyptian social class structure and its history, with the pharaoh not even mentioned in the little pyramid. Obviously, he's up to the top and everyone else is below. Now, this time period is going to come to an end. Just like any civilization and any empire, for example, one reason why it comes to an end is because of a series of good rulers and then a series of bad rulers. Egypt was no different. Towards the end of this first kingdom, the end of the age of the pyramids, the pharaohs are definitely going to go weak as the old kingdom is coming to an end. And there was a series of bad pharaohs as well. It got to a point where there were some civil wars, all right, where the upper class, or the nobles, members of the upper lower class, were starting to fight back with the pharaohs. And as the old kingdom came to an end, what followed the old kingdom was about 100 years of civil war, okay? Where the Egyptians were not focused on continuing to create the great civilization that they had been creating. They decided to fight themselves for about 100 years. And that event is going to mark the end of the Old Kingdom. Now, tomorrow, we'll go ahead and finish part 2 of this lesson, where we'll be talking about the last 2 kingdoms and then talk about some things that you've probably heard of before. But for now, this is where we're going to end.